For nearly 3 decades, the brutal slaying of young Geelong, Australia mother Annette Steward lay shrouded in mystery. Her lifeless body was discovered in her bedroom in 1992, a cold case that seemed destined to remain unsolved, until an unexpected twist in the investigation of another, more recent slaying brought new hope. In the early 1990s, Annette Steward, a vibrant 29-year-old mother of 2, was a beloved member of the Geelong West community. Annette worked at the Winchester factory in Point Henry, where she was known for her cheerful demeanor and hard-working nature. She had a wide circle of friends and was deeply involved in the social life of Geelong West. Annette was described by her friends and family as full of life, always smiling, and willing to lend a helping hand to anyone in need. Her home on Hope Street was a hub of activity, often filled with laughter and the comforting aroma of tea as she entertained friends and neighbors. As a single mother, Annette was dedicated to providing a loving and stable home for her children, 13-year-old Jacinta and 10-year-old Aaron. She balanced her responsibilities with grace, making sure her children felt supported and loved, despite the challenges of raising them on her own. On March 16, 1992, Annette started her day early, heading to her job at the Winchester factory in Point Henry. After finishing her shift around 4:30 p.m., Annette made a few stops in Geelong to run some errands and make some purchases. These routine activities were part of her everyday life and gave no inclination of the horrors that were to come. By early evening, Annette returned to her home on Hope Street. That evening, she invited 4 friends over for tea and to help her fix her television. After they left, Annette prepared for a quiet night at home. But 2 days later, a friend, David Grant, noticed her car was still parked in the driveway, an unusual sight that raised immediate concern. This friend decided to check on Annette, entering the house, only to be met with a horrifying scene. Inside, he discovered Annette's naked body in her bedroom. The home, once a haven of safety and joy, had become the site of an horrific crime. An autopsy would later reveal that Annette had been brutally strangled, a cruel and senseless act that cut her vibrant life short just weeks before her 30th birthday. In the days following the discovery of her body, Geelong West was gripped by shock and grief. The brutal nature of her demise sent ripples through the community, and Victoria Police quickly launched an extensive investigation. Detectives meticulously combed through Annette's home, searching for any clues that might lead to the perpetrator. They interviewed neighbors, friends, and anyone who had been in contact with Annette in the days leading up to her tragic end. The fact that there were no signs of forced entry suggested that Annette might have known her attacker. This was a theory that guided the initial phase of the investigation. Police collected various pieces of evidence from the crime scene, including hair fibers and other forensic materials. One of the primary suspects was a co-worker of Annette's from the Winchester factory. This individual had been named by a coroner as a prime suspect in 2007, but despite being questioned, no charges were brought against him. This suspect, along with several others, were scrutinized thoroughly, but each lead seemed to fizzle out without yielding any concrete results. The community was cooperative, and Annette's friends and family were desperate for answers. But despite the best efforts of the detectives, the investigation began to stall. The absence of modern forensic technology and the lack of substantial evidence made it increasingly difficult to pinpoint the person responsible for the heinous crime. As the months turned into years, Annette's case gradually went cold. By the mid-2000s, it had joined the ranks of many other unsolved cases in Victoria Police's cold case files. Although the original investigators had exhausted all known avenues, Annette's family and friends never gave up hope for justice. In 2015, police offered a $1 million reward for information leading to a resolution in Annette's case. This reward brought in a flurry of tips and renewed public interest, but ultimately failed to produce any actionable evidence. The case remained open but inactive, with detectives waiting on any new information that might break the case open. Then, after nearly 3 decades of unanswered questions, the breakthrough in Annette Steward's case came from an unexpected source. It began with a phone call that reignited hope and set in motion a series of events that would lead to the end of one of Victoria's most perplexing cold cases. In 2019, Victoria Police received a tip-off that would prove to be pivotal. The caller claimed that the person responsible for taking the life of Annette Steward at her home in 1992 was 56-year-old Darren Chalmers. The caller revealed to the police that Chalmers' brother Jamie had once confided in him that Darren Chalmers confessed. Chalmers was working as a gardener with a history of substance abuse, living in Perth, Western Australia. Chalmers was no stranger to the initial investigators of Annette's case. He had admitted to being inside her home on the day she was fatally attacked, but there was insufficient evidence to charge him at the time. Hair fibers collected from the crime scene and retested by cold case detectives yielded a faint DNA match to Chalmers. While this evidence was not strong enough to be used as definitive evidence in court, it confirmed his presence at the scene and renewed the investigators' determination. Fueled by this new development in a case that had long gone cold, Victoria Police collaborated with law enforcement in Western Australia to devise a plan to bring Chalmers to justice. Undercover operatives spent months ingratiating themselves with Chalmers, slowly gaining his trust. Their efforts paid off in January 2020, when Chalmers, believing he was among friends, finally confessed to violently ending Annette Steward's life. He said that he was one of the people invited to drink tea at her house, as he was friends with the man Annette dated at the time. He left after 45 minutes, but came back hours later saying he had no one to celebrate his birthday with and asking to come in. His birthday was a day earlier. Annette agreed, and they drank a bit before she said he could spend the night on her couch. An hour later, he rose, took the life of Annette by bashing her head 3 times with an iron before strangling her with a cord. He then left by the back door. During the same period, he also admitted to another eerily similar crime, the slaying of Dianne Barrett, who had been missing since May 2019. Dianne Barrett, a 60-year-old retired music teacher, was known for her kind spirit and love towards others. Living in Medina, a suburb of Perth, she often extended her generosity to her neighbors. Chalmers, who lived just 2 doors down on Ridley Way, was one such neighbor who had benefited from her compassion. On the evening of May 12, 2019, Dianne invited Chalmers to her home for a meal. After dinner, she accompanied him to his house for a cup of tea. The friendly visit took a dark turn when Chalmers, without any provocation, launched a brutal attack. He jumped on Dianne and used an iron bar across her neck, pressing down with both knees to choke her. The attack lasted for 3 excruciating minutes. After Dianne's senseless demise, Chalmers showed no remorse or respect for her remains and dumped her body in a remote bushland southeast of Perth. To cover his tracks, Chalmers meticulously cleaned his home, wiping away any evidence of the crime. Dianne's disappearance was reported by concerned neighbors when they noticed her dog locked inside her house without food or water, her lights and television still on. This was completely out of character for Dianne, who was last seen alive at a local Bunnings store buying flowers for her elderly mother. Her sudden disappearance and the subsequent discovery of her dog heightened fears for her safety. The investigation into Dianne's case intensified over the following months. In January 2020, during the undercover operation targeting Chalmers, he led police to the location of Dianne's remains. Because of the advanced state of decomposition, she had to be identified through dental records. The exact cause that ended her life could not be determined by forensic pathologists, but Chalmers' confession provided the necessary details to piece together the tragic events of that night. In January 2021, Darren Chalmers pleaded guilty to his involvement in the Dianne Barrett case. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. He must be in prison for at least 20 years before being eligible for parole. During court proceedings, more light was shed on Chalmers' troubled past, which allegedly played a significant role in shaping his violent tendencies. Born and raised in Victoria, Chalmers was made a ward of the state during his teenage years. It was during this vulnerable period that he suffered assault and abuse at the hands of both men and women. These traumatic experiences left him with deep-seated feelings of anger and rage, particularly towards women. This background of abuse and emotional turmoil had seemed to manifest in violent behavior throughout his life. Justice Stephen Hall, who presided over the case, described the slaying of Dianne Barrett as an unprovoked episode of extreme violence. He acknowledged that while Chalmers' substance abuse and troubled past might provide some context for his actions, it did not serve as an excuse. On November 29, 2023, Chalmers returned before the Supreme Court for a pre-sentence hearing on the Annette Steward case. The court was told Chalmers had written a one-page letter to the court, the full details of which were not aired. In it, Chalmers asked never to be released. No parole for 40 years, not 20, not 30, please 40 years plus. I think I deserve it. Victorian Director of Public Prosecutions, Kerry Judd, KC, said Chalmers told the court he took the two women's lives believing he would secure a significant financial benefit for himself. Chalmers was handed another life sentence for taking the life of Annette Steward. He was ordered to serve a single non-parole period of 36 years for both slayings. He will be in his 90s before he is eligible for parole, ensuring that he remains behind bars for the majority, if not the entirety, of his life. Separated by nearly 3 decades, the cases of Annette Steward and Dianne Barrett are forever linked by their perpetrator, Darren Chalmers. The dedicated efforts of cold case detectives using undercover operations were key in solving these crimes. This allows the families of Annette Steward and Dianne Barrett to find solace in the justice served. Annette's 2 children, Jacinta Martin and Aaron Steward, told the court their lives were ripped apart when their mother's life was taken. We were left to feel like a burden on our families. Outside the court, Gillian Steward, the sister of Annette, expressed relief over the sentencing. It is nearly 32 years we have been waiting for this result. Knowing he can never do this to anyone else, this is wonderful. On an April night in 1981, in Texarkana, Arkansas, the lives of 2 innocent children, Karen and Gordon Alexander, were brutally cut short behind the walls of their Carmichael Hill home. Stabbed repeatedly with a butter knife, the heinous crime remained a mystery that haunted the community for over 40 years. Then, just as all hope seemed lost, forensic evidence would bring the truth to the surface, a truth that would lead investigators to someone they trusted the most. In Texarkana, Arkansas, Karen and Gordon Alexander grew up in the warmth of a close-knit community during the 1970s. Their home on Carmichael Hill was seemingly filled with laughter and the love provided by their parents, Weldon and Vera Alexander. While their father worked hard at Cooper Tire and Rubber, their mother nurtured them with care and affection. Karen Alexander was a reserved 8th grader at College Hill Elementary. She was known for her reserved demeanor and the tendency to only speak when spoken to. With aspirations of becoming a nurse one day, Karen's gentle and caring disposition were evident to those that knew her, but her quiet and shy nature also concealed dark secrets. In contrast to his sister's reserved personality, Gordon Alexander had a vibrant energy and zest for life that endeared him to those around him. Despite facing more challenges in his 13 years than many people encounter in a lifetime, Gordon managed to keep his spirits high. Born with a congenital heart defect and enduring open-heart surgery as an infant, Gordon's short life had been marked by setbacks. This included a stroke that left him with limited mobility in his left arm and leg. Undeterred by his physical limitations, Gordon approached life with unwavering optimism and courage. Sadly, fate would deal Gordon another blow when a fall resulted in a broken hip, relegating him to a wheelchair during his recovery. By outward appearances, it seemed that the two siblings had an idyllic life with devoted parents. Unfortunately, behind closed doors, the family dynamic was much more sinister than anyone could have imagined. On April 8, 1981, a quiet morning in Texarkana, Arkansas, turned into a scene of horror that would haunt the community for decades. Weldon Alexander, the father of 14-year-old Karen and 13-year-old Gordon, returned home from his overnight shift at Cooper Tire and Rubber shortly after 7 a.m. When he arrived, he noticed something unusual. The screen door and the wooden front door were both open. Stepping inside, he was met with a gruesome sight. In the kitchen, Weldon found his son Gordon lifeless on the floor. In a panic, Weldon moved through the house and discovered his daughter Karen on her bed near the living room area. She was still alive, but seriously injured, suffering from multiple stab wounds. Weldon immediately called the police, who arrived to confirm the horrific scene. Gordon had already succumbed to his injuries, while Karen was in critical condition, barely clinging on to life. She was quickly transported to St. Michael Hospital, where she would tragically pass away 3 days later on April 11th, having never regained consciousness from a coma. An autopsy revealed that Karen had been assaulted in the hours leading up to her demise. Detectives noted that the weapon, a butter knife, had been left at the scene. Weldon admitted to officers that he had removed the knife from Karen's body and placed it on a nearby bookshelf, which accounted for his fingerprints on the weapon. In the immediate aftermath of the brutal slayings of Karen and Gordon Alexander, the Texarkana Police Department launched an intensive investigation. Officers combed through the Alexander home, meticulously documenting the crime scene and gathering evidence. The lack of forced entry suggested that the perpetrator was someone known to the family. Interviews with neighbors, friends, and family members were conducted, but the trail quickly grew cold. Their father reported that their mother, Vera, had been in a psychiatric ward at the time of the tragedy. With no clear suspects and little physical evidence to go on, the investigation stalled and the case went cold. In 1983, a glimmer of hope appeared when Henry Lee Lucas, a violent, convicted felon awaiting trial in Texas, began confessing to numerous unsolved crimes across the United States. Lucas manipulated law enforcement by providing detailed accounts of various slayings, gaining perks such as road trips and restaurant meals in return. He would claim responsibility for the Alexander children's case, saying that he had entered their home and attacked them as they slept. His confession initially seemed credible, as he had drifted through Texarkana around the time of the tragedy. But further investigation revealed that Lucas had been working in Florida at the time of the slayings, debunking his confession. Forensic evidence would later confirm that Lucas's DNA did not match the samples found at the scene, forcing detectives back to square one. The Alexander family was devastated by the loss of Karen and Gordon. A month after the tragedy, Weldon and Vera Alexander moved out of their home and relocated across town. In 1984, Vera Alexander, overwhelmed by grief, took her own life at the age of 37. Weldon Alexander would eventually remarry and have 2 more children. Decades later, the cold case was reopened in February 2023 by retired Captain Calvin Steward, who had a personal and professional connection to the original investigation. The decision came after the Facebook page Justice for Karen and Gordon Alexander gained popularity. Driven by advancements in DNA technology and a determination to find justice for the Alexander children, Steward, along with forensic criminologist Dr. Todd Steffi and DNA scientist Kelly Dixon, revisited the evidence. DNA extracted from the victim's fingernail tissue revealed a familial match implicating their own father, Weldon Alexander. Further investigation showed that fibers and materials from the crime scene matched those used at Weldon's workplace. Based on the new evidence, investigators developed a theory of what they believe happened on the night of April 7, 1981. According to their reconstruction of events, Weldon Alexander had been assaulting his daughter Karen for at least 6 months before the crime. On that tragic night, he attempted to do it once again. Karen's brother Gordon likely stumbled upon the assault and attempted to intervene. In a fit of rage, or perhaps desperation to silence his son, Weldon attacked Gordon first, using a butter knife to do so. Weldon then turned his attention to his daughter, who had managed to reach the living room. There, he unleashed another violent attack. Weldon Alexander lived out his remaining years quietly, passing away in 2014 from complications related to Alzheimer's disease at the age of 80. He lived a long life, and his passing was peaceful, 2 luxuries that he ruthlessly stole from his own children. It took 42 years, but the breakthrough in 2022, driven by the dedication of retired Captain Calvin Steward and his team, finally brought the truth to light. Although Weldon never faced justice for his heinous acts, the resolution of the case provided long-awaited answers and a sense of closure for the community and surviving family members. In Jerome, Idaho, the unsolved slaying of 84-year-old Wilma Mobley cast a long shadow over the community for nearly 3 decades. Despite suspicions and investigations, the case remained cold until modern DNA technology revealed the identity of her perpetrator. Now, the quiet town is rocked once more as the truth behind Wilma's brutal demise finally comes to light. 84-year-old Wilma Mobley lived a quiet life in her modest home in Jerome, Idaho. Like many residents in small towns, she likely knew her neighbors by name, exchanged pleasantries with passerby, and found comfort in the familiar routines of daily life. But the tranquility of Jerome was shattered on the night of August 10, 1995, when Wilma's peaceful life was brutally disrupted and cut short. On that evening, Jerome police officers responded to a distressing call at Wilma's residence on West Avenue I, only to discover a scene of unimaginable horror. Wilma lay lifeless within her own home, the victim of a vicious attack that left her strangled and subjected to the brutality of an axe. The community was shaken to its core as news of the heinous crime spread like wildfire, leaving residents reeling with shock and disbelief that something so terrible could happen to an innocent elderly woman who never harmed anyone. Investigators narrowed the list of suspects down to 3 people, but one figure stood out from the rest: 34-year-old Dianne Lee Kennison. Kennison was a neighbor with a troubled past and a penchant for erratic behavior. Suspicion swirled around him, with many believing that he must have been involved in some way. Kennison's actions in the aftermath of Wilma's brutal slaying painted a portrait of guilt in the eyes of investigators. Kennison's efforts to eliminate evidence, moving from his residence, altering his appearance with a fresh haircut and shaven beard, cast an even larger shadow of doubt over his innocence. Investigators believed Kennison to be the prime suspect in the case and even sought out an arrest warrant. Unfortunately, the prosecutor felt that the evidence was too insufficient at the time, and the case ground to a halt. With the investigation nearing a standstill, there was a looming fear that Wilma's case would remain unsolved, leaving her loved ones and the Jerome community in a state of lingering uncertainty. Former Jerome County Sheriff and Detective Chatterin first delved into the case in 1999, remaining on it until 2001. His frustrations grew as the absence of critical evidence, such as fingerprints or a suspect's blood sample, hindered progress, leaving the case in a frustrating state of limbo. In 1998, there was a small glimmer of hope in the case when Kennison's wife pointed fingers at him, alleging he confessed to Wilma's slaying. Her testimony was later retracted, casting doubt on its reliability. Even with Kennison's questionable past and shaky alibi, the investigation hit another end. For investigators and the community of Jerome, it seemed that this was a case that would never be solved, and as the years dragged on, the hope for justice seemed to dim. Until a break in the case came nearly 30 years after the crime took place. The breakthrough came after Detective Wagner took charge of the case in June 2022. With a fresh perspective and renewed determination, he meticulously reviewed the evidence, seeking overlooked details and potential leads. By the end of July, it became evident that a deeper investigation was warranted. In February 2023, the case was officially reopened, marking a significant milestone in the pursuit of justice for Wilma Mobley. The renewed efforts aimed to uncover the truth and bring closure to a long-standing mystery that had haunted the community for years. Then, in March of the same year, the Idaho State Police Forensic Lab delivered a breakthrough. Advancements in DNA technology enabled meticulous analysis of the evidence. This ultimately led to the conclusive identification of Kennison as the perpetrator. For Wilma's family, the truth behind who committed such a heinous crime brings a bittersweet solace, providing a semblance of peace after years of questions and anguish. It took nearly 30 years for Wilma's case to be solved, and yet there is still a small sense of injustice. Even with the confirmation that her neighbor, Dianne Lee Kennison, was the perpetrator, his fate brings no retribution for her loved ones. In 2001, Kennison took his own life and evaded the consequences of his actions, denying Wilma's family the opportunity for proper closure through the justice system.